Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me. And thank you for your patience. Thank you for putting up with the technology glitches. Thank you to Irene for inviting me. Thank you to Martin Curley, my friend, for introducing me to Irene. Thank you to Michelle, who's put up with me all over the place. I can truly say what I wanted to say before, that I do feel that Ireland is my ancestral land, and you'll feel that as and understand that as I talk about my ancestors as I go through. In Australia, I might be giving an acknowledgement of country, but here we don't do that, and my pronunciation of the Irish language could be best described as woeful. But what I promise you is that what I lack up in pronunciation of the Irish language, I can make up in English. I've inherited a love of speaking, or as my late mother would say, the sound of my own voice. So I want to tell you tonight about my ancestors and a few others, their lives and the impact that they've had on me personally and history. Right, we're right. Everyone can see the screen at home. I'm hoping that's all still going really well. Yeah. I live in Greta. It's in the northeast of the state of Victoria, Australia. This area is well known for its rich history and heritage. And whilst there's no longer a town called Greta like there was in the 1880s, we still have a vibrant, active and very proud community. Everyone who arrived in colonial Australia could be called a pioneer and said to have blazed a trail. Some came free, others had little choice for lots of reasons. And as always, there's a bigger story to tell, and I'm going to tell some of those stories tonight. As my presentation unfolds, you will see how my ancestors played their part in Australian history and shaped all those that came after them. I am directly descended from two famine orphans, both sent as 16-year-old girls to Australia. And one of my great-great-grandmother's sisters was also a famine orphan. And I will talk to you about their story, my family's story, and the story of some of the people that crossed their paths. But first, I must start here in Ireland, of course. If I were giving this talk in Australia, I would outline the penal laws, because most people in Australia, unless they are a family historian or a local historian, they would not have heard of that. And I had a fascinating conversation with my boss about how this parallels what happened to the First Nations people in Australia and what that meant, and how the British, the colonisers of any country that they went to, passed laws not being able to speak your language, practice your religion, how you could not have land, all of those things in Australia as Aborigines could. People here tonight know that these laws lasted in Ireland until Catholic emancipation in 1829 and included the points made on my slide. I don't need to go through all of that for you in this room, but for those watching and for the recording, they include the fact that Catholics could not receive an education, they could not practice their religion, they could not vote, they could not serve in public office. Catholics and Protestants could not intermarry, they could not own firearms, they could not vote, they could not purchase nor lease land, and interestingly, they could not adopt orphan children, nor could they own a horse valued at more than £5. And as you know, it's estimated that at the time of the famine, only 1/8 of the population lived in urban areas. So industry was only just beginning to take off in the cities of Belfast, Dublin, Cork, and Ireland really depended on her land. And in the poorest parts of Ireland, there could be up to 700 people per square mile. So those laws had a huge impact on everyone. We know that the bulk of the population lived with the insecurity of tenant farming, labouring and poverty. Most of the land was owned by English and Anglo-Irish, and with this came all the power and authority of being a landlord. This is nothing new to the people in this room, but it's very new to most people, even of Irish extraction in Australia. So when I give these talks, this is a really important part. And I spoke to Irene and we decided we would leave these things in, and I would tell you that this is why I talk about this, because it's really important to set the scene as to why my ancestors went to Australia and what happened. Rents had to be paid. Tenants relied on their crops to prosper to pay that rent. They had no choice about that. The staple of the poor tenant farmer was, of course, the potato. It could grow in the poorest of condition with very little effort. An acre of land could grow enough to feed a family for a year, perhaps with surplus to sell. Potatoes were cheap and easy to grow. And as the population grew, land was subdivided again and again until with the smallest possible lot that could sustain a family. In 1837, a French traveller observed, "The Irish Catholic finds only one profession within his reach, and when he does not have the capital necessary to become a farmer, he digs the ground as a labourer. He who has not a spot of ground to cultivate dies of famine." Those words were penned well before the years known as the Great Famine of 1845-50. We know that the poor of Ireland had faced poverty, famine, disease and discrimination for centuries. That wasn't new. Crops had failed in the past. However, there was always a concern of what was there to fall back on if the potato crop failed. For me, and for people in Australia and other places where history is not so familiar, when we talk of the Irish potato famine, the Great Hunger, Annaghdown, people will often say to me, but there were things to eat beside potatoes, or other crops were saved, or things were bad before those years. What's the big deal about potatoes? They'll always say that. We know that there's been a number of famines before 1845. There had been famines recorded in 1816, 17, 1822, 26 and 31. Starvation and death had occurred, but relief came reasonably quickly. Almost 4,000 vessels carried food from Ireland to Bristol, Liverpool and London during 1847, when 400,000 Irish men, women and children died of starvation and related diseases. So we know that there was food and other crops here in Ireland. Other commodities to leave Ireland in 1847 included peas, beans, onions, rabbits, salmon, oysters, herring, lard, and the list goes on. There is a reason, however, that those years are called the Great Potato Famine, because for years the Irish had planted a strong, robust strain, but as the demand to produce as many potatoes as possible grew, there was a move to the weaker strain, the lumper, immune to many diseases, but fatally not to the blight that would cause the crops to turn black and wither within hours, year after year. Reports of the blight had been in America since 1842-3. In June 1845, however, reports came from Belgium, and this new blight had begun to spread through Europe, causing huge crop failures and killing thousands. Once again, though, these countries were less dependent on the potatoes than our poor tenant farmers in Ireland. In 1845, the blight was widespread, but still thought of as a once-off failure, as other years had been. But it did fail year after year. Healthy crops would wither and turn within hours. Reports of seeing green fields turn black and rancid, smelling, were abundant. The stench was said to be overpowering. People were left with nothing to eat, no ability to pay their rents, no ability to buy food. They sold everything they owned. With the loss of the crops and with no ability to work the land and pay the rent, families were evicted from their homes. That is, if there was anyone left alive to throw off the land, and the homes were demolished. And I always preface this with, especially in Australia, because people start to say you're being very dramatic, Noeleen. And I say, well, if I am being overly dramatic or deliberately provocative, maybe I am. But I'm also being deliberately truthful, for the evictions and demolitions are well documented. Unlike the names of those who died, one of the worst areas for evictions was West Clare. Families turned out onto the roads and ditches and their homes destroyed. They took to begging. Those that had nowhere else and who could make it ended up in the workhouse. Those that didn't died in their beds or on the roadsides. The reports of green-tinged mouths from eating nettles and grass are not exaggerated. They had no option but to wander the countryside or beg the workhouses if there was room, or to die on the roadside. The very lucky, with some family assistance or by paying a bounty, chose to emigrate. Thousands to America, Canada and Australia, many aboard the notorious coffin ships, dying before they reached anywhere. And then people say, but what about relief? Surely something must have been happening. The predominant theory of the day was that people should be self-sufficient. To give people charity would weaken their ability to look after themselves. Only the destitute were given accommodation in the workhouses. Life in the workhouse was not the easy way out. Families were separated, males, females and children were all sent to various wards. They did not mingle. Each person was required to work for the privilege of being fed, clothed and provided with a bed in an overcrowded dormitory. You could not just leave, even though technically you could. Often families would not know if another family member lived or died. Disease and starvation could still occur in a workhouse. They were referred to inmates, and this surprises many people. They were inmates, that's what they were referred to. There was a noted rise in crime, the most common crime being the theft of food or clothing, not crimes against people. Most, however, died before they could come to trial. Michelle and I visited Portumna Workhouse today, and we talked to the young tour guide there about how we know it's very well documented that a number of people committed crimes to be transported to Australia because it was better to face a life of transportation and at least be fed and live and and know that you will be free after 7 years or 14 years or even life than to die or face even worse, life on hulks or prisons here in Ireland. Relief schemes were organised, but they were not enough. Relief was meant to be paid for by the landowners. It wasn't enough. Soup kitchens could not sustain the enormous amount of demand. People were employed building fences and roads that went to nowhere, and I've been showing Michelle what that looks like, which is quite shocking until you see it yourself. It's really hard to explain. The crops failed again in 1846, and then came what was to be known as Black 47. The winter of 1846-47 was the coldest in Irish living memory. The crops failed again, not due to blight, it was a poor harvest. The workhouses were strained, people were dying in the tens of thousands. Conditions were perfect for the spread of disease. Typhus fever spread through the lands and the city. The weak would, of course, succumb easily, but so would the healthy. This knew no favourite. Again, the blight took the crop of 1848. This year also saw the outbreak of cholera. 1849 was another of the hardest years. This is a really interesting slide that I find, the census and the deaths. Between 1845 and 1851, almost 24% of the estimated 1845 population had disappeared. And that's what I talk about again a lot, because it really is, you can't lie with statistics. People can say, well, it's just oral history, but when you start talking statistics, that really starts to make people sit up and take notice. It's estimated that more than 1 million died and 1 million emigrated, but the figures are only estimates. Many died on the side of the road or were placed in burial pits with no name. Chutes were built in many workhouse hospitals. The bodies could be pushed straight into a burial pit, then covered in lime. Their names never recorded. Carts could recover bodies on the roads and fields. They would be unceremoniously tipped into pits. You can walk all over Ireland and be reminded of the mass burial sites. The forlorn stone will be the marker. And that's how I set the scene. As I said, I'm sure that I've told most people here everything that they already know, and I'm very happy for you to amend, add, strengthen any of my information. Any good historian or researcher needs to be continually looking at their work and taking on board anything. And so I come to Earl Grey, he of the tea, which I don't know anyone who really likes to drink. So in 1848, a scheme attributed the British Secretary of State, Earl Grey, began. Young girls aged between 16 and 21 were selected from all 163 workhouses across Ireland from all 32 counties. They would be part of an immigration scheme that was influenced by three things: the increasing number of orphan children in workhouses, lobbying for suitable female immigration to New South Wales, and the difficulties in finding enough suitable females from England and Scotland willing to immigrate as domestics to the colonies. The English and Scottish were much more preferred. There was a lot of bigotry. The girls were also being sought to ease the widening gap between the male and female population. The men of Australia, free settler and ex-convict, not only needed servants, but wives. In the 2 years the scheme was in place, 20 ships arrived, 4,114 girls to Sydney, Melbourne and Adelaide. The first ship, of course, named the Earl Grey, arrived in Sydney in 1848. 6 arrived in Melbourne, or what was then known as Hobson's Bay, the first being the Lady Kennaway. Over 1,200 girls arrived in Melbourne, and they would make their way to Customs House, now the Immigration Museum, and then be assigned work. We know from there that over 200 girls faced a further journey to Portland, which is on the coast of Victoria, and from there also to the goldfields of Victoria. And that's a list of the other ships. They weren't automatically welcomed, and the press kept up a steady stream of headlines and articles that included "No Irish Need Apply," and this related to the girls, "Dirty brutes," "Most stupid and ignorant," "Were they not so utterly depraved they are so stupid they are fit for nothing," "The class is utterly useless to the colony and in fact mischievous." There's no doubt that this played a huge part in the demise of the scheme just 2 years into its inception. Each year, along with other family members, I attend the Irish Famine Orphan Girls Commemoration ceremony at Williamstown in Melbourne and look out across Hobson's Bay. And I need to talk about this because this is one before I get to be talking about the girls from Annaghdown, because it also sets the story and where my line converges. I look out across Hobson's Bay and I try to imagine the sight of a large group of young girls with their shifts hiked up as they wade into shore across the mud flats. Flats, I think I just said flaps, flats. I probably need another cup of tea. I think of 16-year-old Jane Hutchinson, my 3 times great-grandmother, one of 136 orphans who arrived on the Derwent on 25th of February 1850. The shipping register lists Jane as a 16-year-old house servant from County Derry who could neither read nor write, but could spell. A search of records in County Derry takes us to, now here's where my Irish is going to be terrible and I always get picked up, Marhafelt Workhouse. It's recorded that 13-year-old Jane first entered the workhouse on the 13th of October 1846 with her widowed mother and 3 siblings after being found begging on the streets. This stay was not extended. They exited less than 3 months later, on 6th of January 1847. Jane was back in the workhouse, the same workhouse, on the 9th of June 1848, now aged 15, but there's no mention of her family. In June 1848, more than 50 people per week were seeking to be admitted to that workhouse, which by then was bursting through the walls with almost 900 inmates. 16 months later, in October 1849, Jane was chosen for the Earl Grey Famine Scheme. The stories of how most of the girls ended up in the workhouses may be hazy and lost to time, but from the moment they were chosen to be part of Earl Grey's scheme, they became part of Australian history. Plucked from hardship, squalor and disease that came with workhouse life, these girls and the life and legacy they forged cannot be understated. They were young girls who bravely took destiny into their hands, and I call them young warriors who stepped out into the unknown. The girls chosen for the scheme must have had an unblemished character. They must have had or been vaccinated against smallpox. They came from desperate circumstances. After all, they were in the workhouse. Most, but not all, were orphans. The definition of orphan at the time was that they must have one or less parent. Some did have one surviving parent. All were destitute, all had a choice. All were willing to come to the new world. Each girl was given a new trunk, 2 feet long, 14 inches wide and deep. Her name was to be stencilled on the front. She was to be provided fresh, suitable clothing, items for sewing and a Bible. She was given a certificate of good character and health, a bit like livestock. She had been a willing passenger, yet what choice is it when the only choice is to stay and starve or remain in a workhouse? Jane left Plymouth on the 5th of November 1849, bound for Melbourne and a new life. The voyage took 112 days. The girls then made their way by dray or boat to Customs House, where they were allocated to employers. Some girls would find good, kind and decent people. Others were not so lucky, and the records will tell a sad story, including that of a 13-year-old girl who tried to take her life twice by throwing herself into the river and eventually did so. And when the autopsy was done, it was found that she was with child and her master was married. So we can draw a conclusion from that. Mr. Madden employed Jane at Mary Creek, which is just out of Melbourne, and she likely met her future husband there. That's Jane. Jane Hutchinson and Thomas Buckler. We're really lucky, and I'm really lucky that I've got photos of this part of my family. Thomas Buckler, looking a bit like a Wild West character there, was born in Nuneaton, Warwickshire, England, and on the 23rd of October 1844, along with several accomplices, he broke into a shopkeeper's premises, stealing 17 pairs of boots and shoes, a quantity of cheese and butter, and 1 pair of scissors. So he was having a pretty red hot go. He was 17 and he received 10 years of transportation for his efforts. He was sent to Pentonville Prison in Middlesex. I don't know if people have heard about the Pentonville system, but it was a new system that was meant to rehabilitate people. Prisoners spent the first 18 months of their sentence in silent, solitary confinement, followed by a period of hard labour in public works. They were then transported to Australia. On arrival, they were given a conditional pardon, provided they didn't return to England within the term of their original sentence. Thomas arrived at Port Phillip in 1844 aboard the Maitland. At the time of his and Jane's marriage, they were both listed as living in Campaspe River, which is again north of Melbourne. Thomas was 7 years older than his wife, and what we know is that when these girls came out of their indenture, they got married pretty much straight away because they were young and they were going to need someone to look after them. They would soon find their way to the northeast, just a little further and southwest of what we know as Wangaratta now, just where the main town, not far from where I live. And we know they were there in 1853 when their first child was born there. Thomas worked for a man called Benjamin Warby on a large, prosperous Camnick run, which was a massive selection before eventually selecting his land in North Wangaratta, where they would farm and grow a large garden. Jane and Thomas would have 12 children, and Jane would live to see the new century in. She died in 1906. Age 77, is buried in Wangaratta Cemetery. A week before Jane had left Plymouth aboard the Derwent, another ship carrying Irish famine orphans also left, bound for Sydney. When the Thomas Arbuthnot docked in Sydney Cove on the 5th of February 1850, she carried 194 young Irish orphan girls, predominantly from South West Ireland. Amongst those 194 were two sisters. My great-great-grandmother, Bridget Young, aged 16, and her 21-year-old sister, Mary. Bridget and Mary Young have their place of residence recorded as Annaghdown, County Galway. The entry notes that they could neither read nor write, and that their parents, Michael and Ellen, were deceased. I'm told the girls were most likely from the Annaghdown workhouse, which is an auxiliary workhouse of the Tuam Poor Union. We've not found written documentation to confirm this, but the search continues. Today, I still can't tell you what happened to their parents or if they had any other siblings, and again, the investigation continues. The 194 girls from all the workhouses were sent to Dublin then by steamer to England, where they gathered at Plymouth, along with several other passengers who were immigrating. I wonder what was going through their minds. Leaving Ireland would never have entered their minds at any other time. If any of the families had talked about immigrating, they would have at least been immigrating with each other. Although the girls were primarily alone, many, like our Bridget and Mary, were part of a sibling group that left the workhouses together. These girls were subject to trauma, grief, and loss, and it would mark them. Today, we know that a person's individual experiences, especially trauma, will live with and impact them forever. Some can live good, strong lives, but it will still affect them. It influences thinking and behaviour. It shapes a person's thought processes and determines how they can form intimate and platonic relationships. It can also explain why some actions can be seen as cold-hearted or lacking in emotion. It influences how they see the world and why they may find it difficult to trust. Experiences are passed down, old hurts are harboured. I can't stress enough that the workhouse was an institution, and I say this over and over when I speak in Australia to get people to understand what these young girls came from. Knowing what we do today of institutional conditions and abuse, and especially because of the work that I do, I believe we should look at these girls, as I said, as warriors surviving years of poverty, famine, death, institutionalisation and abuse. However, we are really fortunate with the voyage of the Thomas Arbuthnot that the ship's surgeon superintendent, sorry, a little bit of a stutter, by all accounts a decent and kind man, kept a journal that survived. Dr. Charles chronicled the voyage, life on the ship, the barracks, and the weeks and months afterward. He was responsible for the girls' health and well-being on the journey and immediately after landing. Because of his record keeping, we know so much about the voyage and what happened to those particular girls on the voyage and on arrival in Sydney. The girls spent 99 days aboard the ship. For the most part, there was little trouble. Strutt was keenly aware of the girls' loss. He mentions their grief at leaving Ireland and how small groups took to keening and wailing for their loss, or a dismal howling, as he wrote it. Threatened with no pudding, the girls decided that singing and dancing was better pastime. He often remarks that the girls are neat and clean, except for Harriet Cassidy, who is naturally slovenly. He keeps up a steady pressure against holes, rags, tatters, and dirt. He doesn't win with Harriet, though. After arriving in Sydney Harbour, the ship and passengers were inspected for any signs of disease. Once everything was in order, they sailed into Sydney Cove a day later. The girls were offloaded and taken to Hyde Park Barracks, Hyde Park, a bit like general livestock. They were registered, fed, watered, and generally seen to. An article in the paper mentions how well these girls look. Their appearance was superior to any shipment yet forwarded here. A significant number of girls were found positions in Sydney and surrounding areas. However, our girls would remain with Strutt a bit longer, and I'm really glad they did. I'm grateful to him because he took care for these girls. His kindness and compassion shined through, and his need to find them in suitable employment with kind masters. They're his words. His record keeping is what keeps their story alive. He constantly referred to them as my girls, and it's evident that he cared deeply about finding them safe and secure placements. On the 18th of February, over 100 of the original group left Sydney by steamer to Parramatta. They climbed aboard bullock drays for the overland trip to Yass Depot. They pulled up outside Hamilton Hume's cottage. Has anyone heard of Hamilton Hume? The great Hamilton Hume, he did all the exploration from Sydney down to Westernport Cove in Melbourne. So the great explorer who said that nobody had ever lived on this land before. Hamilton Hume was one of Australia's great explorers, and he and his brothers had vast tracts of land given to them for their great works of exploration. At this point, I wonder who observed the girls, and did anyone talk to them? Why do I ask this? That's going to become clear a little bit later. The girls got out their boxes and they made themselves smart before entering Yass. In Yass, over half the girls were found employment, including our girls. Bridget and Mary were indentured to Mr. W.K. Smith of Mingay Station, Gundagai, for 2 years. Mingay is on the banks of the mighty Murrumbidgee River. I've stood in front of that homestead that stands there now, looking towards the river flats, wondering, is this where Bridget stood? As an aside, the previous owner of Mingay Station was Benjamin Warby, that same guy that owned the station where my Jane went to. Nothing has come to light on the years that the girls were there, now women, but we can pick up their story when they got married. Bridget met Richard Hart sometime, also known as Richard Harding. He was an ex-convict transported to Australia in 1835 aboard the Lady Macnaghten, aged 18. He was an errand boy. He'd been trialled at the Dublin Assizes for picking pockets. He earned his ticket of leave on the 26th of January 1840 and his certificate of freedom 3 years later. His sister Anne and brother Nicholas would be transported later for similar offences, both younger than him. Nothing tells us how he met Bridget, but it's easy to imagine young Bridget may have been seeking something more than a life of servitude, and she married her ticket of leave man in 1852 at Gundagai. 16 years her senior, Richard had been in the colony for almost that length of time. Richard had worked for John Kennedy Hume, brother of Hamilton. This Hume had established a station later called Collingwood on the Fish River at Gunning. And the famous Hume and Hovell's overland expedition commenced in 1824. John Kennedy Hume was killed at Gunning by the Whitten gang of bushrangers in 1840. It's believed that Richard continued to work for the widow and possibly worked for her when he married Bridget. Remember that the girls stopped at Hume's cottage on their way into Yass? They also passed through Gunning and stopped near the homestead. And I wonder, did they meet any of the men along the way? And maybe a young Galway lass took Richard's eye, but we'll never know that. A baby was born and died in the same year that they married, then a daughter before the family appears in Victoria, quickly tracked from the births of subsequent children. John Kennedy Hume's widow came to Victoria to take up residence at her property Burramine just down the Murray River in the early 50s. This is the same time that the young Hart family left Gundagai, and they make their first appearance at the 3 Mile Creek, South Wangaratta. We know this because of the baptisms of the children. It is possible that Richard followed and worked for her. How did they become to be able to purchase such large tracts of land? Did the widow assist a loyal man? That's the question I have. Richard and Bridget would have 12 children together. They lived on the farm at South Wangaratta with some more land at the base of what we call the Warby Ranges. They were prosperous farmers, did really well for themselves, an ex-convict and an Irish famine orphan. We know that all the children went to school. They could all read and write. They continued their Catholic faith, with all the children being baptised in the local parish. The family were really well respected. Their middle son was named Stephen, a good student, rode well, was a jockey at the local races for a time. Stephen, or Steve as he was known, was born at the Hart property on 3 Mile Creek, Wangaratta on the 4th of October 1859 and baptised in October that year. In July 1877, 18-year-old Steve appeared before the local magistrate, charged with stealing a horse. The charge was later changed from theft to illegally using a horse. Steve had repeatedly stated he had been loaned it. Still, he was given 12 months of hard labour at the Beechworth jail, and Beechworth was a major jail in the area. It was here he met a Greta local named Dan Kelly. And do people know who Ned Kelly is? Yeah. He joined the Greta mob on release, well known for their swagger and flash. They were flash young men, let me tell you. He would come to know Dan's older brother, Ned Kelly, who, along with their mate Joe Byrne and Ned's cousins, the Lloyds, were well known to local police. What did Bridget think of this? We don't know, but her older children would also become friends with the Kelly and the Lloyd boys and their mates. These mates were always welcome at the Hart property. The Greta area had many, many Irish immigrants, many who had found their way freely, many who had been transported or been sent out as part of the famine scheme. On the 26th of October 1878, Bridget's life would be changed forever. Her son and his mates would be involved in an incident that would lead them to destruction and heartbreak. Deep in what is known as the Wombat Ranges near Mansfield, amid the thick forest, a party of 4 Victorian troopers were ambushed by Ned and Dan Kelly, Joe Byrne and Steve Hart. At the end of that day, 3 police lay dead, 1 had escaped, and 4 young men were on the run. They would become known as the Kelly Gang. They would be outlawed and a price was on their head. Today, we know that Steve did not shoot a trooper, but he was there and he was culpable. The 4 would be hunted, their families watched and questioned. Steve's older brother, Richard Junior, always known as Dick, was branded a sympathiser and could be arrested any time. His sister, Etty, was known to help the gang. Some say that she and Ned were sweethearts and hinted a secret marriage, but there's no proof. The story of the gang's really well known, and we have no idea what Bridget thought about this, other than we know that the family farm was watched continually. Family law tell us it was a haven. A few years earlier in 1876, Bridget had lost another son. Her younger son, Nicholas, had died aged 14, and now her other son was on the run. Bridget's loved son would die in June 1880 at the siege of Glenrowan alongside his mates Dan Kelly and Joe Byrne. His other mate, Ned Kelly, would be hanged for murder later that year. Bridget and Richard remained and were well respected in the local district despite this tragedy, staying on the farm at South Wangaratta. Bridget died in 1898, aged 64, and is buried at the Wangaratta Cemetery. I always have been aware of my family connections to the Kelly gang and our deep connections and our feelings for Ireland. It didn't seem that several generations at all were separating us from Island shores, and in fact, Steve's younger sister is my father's grandmother, and she died in 1958. That's not far away at all. As I continued my research, though, it emerged that another 16-year-old who had been on the Thomas Arbuthnot was connected to me, if not by blood, then certainly by history. Margaret White left Scariff Workhouse in 1849. Her mother dead and her father's fate was unknown. She was part of the group that travelled from Hyde Park Barracks. She was indentured as a house servant on Tirelessly station near Bungendore, which is up in New South Wales. She would meet Paddy Byrne, the son of another ex-convict from County Carlow who was convicted of swearing oaths, and marry him in 1855. That's Margaret and Paddy. They would make their way to the northeast Victoria, not very far from where Bridget and Richard lived, but Paddy chased gold. He wasn't a farmer. They settled at a place called Sebastopol, and it was here that their first son, Joseph, was born. He would meet up with those young men from Greta and become part of the events that took him far from what Margaret had hoped for her son. Joe Byrne had been part of the Kelly gang, and he was the first to die at the siege of Glenrowan. Margaret would not claim her son's body. She had reportedly stated that he had made his bed. Many see this as a cruel and cold statement, but I wonder, what did a woman who suffered much trauma and loss as a child through the workhouse do and need to do to protect herself? She'd spent time in an institution and her life was already changed forever. Sadly, one of Margaret's daughters herself would enter an institution for the insane, and I use that word because that's the word of the time, in her early 20s, and die there in her 70s, having spent 50 years away from her family. Much has been written about Margaret's perceived coldness to her children's fate, but how can we judge and determine anyone's rationale or manner of coping? Margaret had been institutionalised as a young woman as well, and what scars did it leave? So we have two famine orphans, the same ship, both in the Kelly gang, and what does this mean? So many connections. Are they coincidental? I don't believe in coincidences anywhere. I can't offer any truth, or proof, but there are so many connecting lines. Many of the Irish famine orphan girls settled in the northeast, as is many convicts. Some would have sons and daughters who are connected to the Kelly gang as sympathisers. Did the girls stay in touch? I don't know. There's no evidence to suggest either way. Margaret could read and write, but Bridget could not. Did they realise who the parents of the other gang members were? No evidence. Can we just put it down to coincidence? I don't think so, but I can't prove that. Time moved on, as it must. Bridget and her husband died, and their children remained in the area. Richard Junior on the original block. In 1899, one of Bridget's younger daughters, Rachel, there she is, married Tom Lloyd, first cousin of Ned and Dan Kelly, a mate of Steve Hart and Joe Byrne, great friend of the Hart family. Tom had been a man of 25 when his cousins and mates had died at Glenrowan. Rachel, a mere child of 10, when her brother's charred remains were raked from the Glenrowan Inn for a gruesome photo to be taken. And I will never willingly display that photo. And that photo is still put up all over the internet and in books of the two burnt bodies that were raked from the ashes. And Rachel was at that siege and was at that wake later. Tom raised a family of 12 with his first partner, Maggie Kelly, Ned's sister, before she died aged 38. Rachel would take on those children, the youngest 18 months, and have another 6 children. I think she must have been an incredible woman to do that. Rachel lived at Greta until Tom died in 1927. Then she sold the farm and spent time between her children and sisters. She chose not to be buried at Greta with Tom, but next to her parents in Wangaratta. Bridget's children prospered, as did their children and the generations since. Within 2 generations, Bridget had a grandson in the police force, one sitting on the judicial bench. Many of the subsequent generations are serving police. The stigma of bushranging did not linger within the family. All are proud of their family history and do not shy away from it. Rachel's last child, Leo, down there born in 1910, is my grandfather. He married Mary Taylor, great-granddaughter of that very first famine orphan, Jane Hutchison, and that's where my families combine. These women have such eerily similar stories. They both arrived aged 16 in 1850 within 2 weeks of each other. Both of them married ex-convicts in 1852 when they were just aged 18. Both settled in the northeast of Victoria and had large families, and both were incredibly resilient. They are buried in Wangaratta Cemetery within 20 metres of each other. And here's the new generation. When I first visited Hyde Park in Sydney in 2005, my daughter Kelly had not long turned 17, not much older than her 3 times great-grandmother. And when she had left Ireland, I have no doubt that Bridget's blood flows through this girl of mine who is now 36. If she had needed to go across the world at 16, she would have done whatever she'd need. But how young is 16? Every year, or I try to, every year a ceremony is held at Sydney to remember all the girls and everybody who went to Australia, and remember everyone who suffered and died as part of the Annaghdown and the Irish diaspora. On the way to Sydney, we've stopped near Mingay, where Bridget lived and worked. We pick wattle and we lay at the ceremony. Those girls were carriers of the strength and the character and spirit, and it's passed down. A ceremony is also held in Williamstown in Melbourne. On the foreshore stands Famine Rock. And that ceremony has been held for over 20 years to remember the 6 ships that landed there. When I started my research, built on years of work by family, I never knew where it would take me. I didn't know it was going to bring me here tonight. And I encourage everyone I speak to persevere and embrace it, to discover the things that will amaze and appall you, challenge, confront, things that bring you great joy, but things that will make you weep. But really importantly, you'll find a community that embraces you, to join with other descendants and people to commemorate the girls in Melbourne, Sydney, anywhere. Pride in the women that came before us, the women who shaped our country, because those women were not only the backbone and skeleton, but they gave our future women a voice. Their daughters and granddaughters would march and fight to be heard and vote in Australia, second only in the world to New Zealand. My research has taken me all over Australia. It's brought me to Ireland, and it's allowed me to make so many connections and friends. My first trip was with my cousin Lola in 2012, and it was so emotional. We were able to visit so many places we'd only ever heard or read about. We walked into places where our ancestors had been. We walked graveyards. We went to mass. We walked for miles. We laughed and we cried. In 2019, just before COVID, my sister-in-law and I were able to bring my then 80-year-old dad and his 82-year-old cousin, who is Lola, back here to Ireland on what was the most rewarding, emotional, hilarious, sometimes frustrating journey for them and me. These two are still very hearty and hale, and they are Bridget Young's great-grandchildren. This extraordinary trip is one not only of discovery, but it's one of making memories, and I encourage everyone who's thinking about it to give it a go. The connections I've made in Ireland in telling the girls' story has always made it feel we're bringing them home, because that's what it is. These girls were and are part of Ireland, and whilst they did choose to go, they had no choice. We continue to try and find our Irish relatives through the power of DNA, but sadly, I've had no luck finding Bridget's family. And I can only think at the moment that there's been very little family to carry on that. To stand on the docks, at workhouse gates, churches, famine graveyards, is to know the struggle these girls have and had. Miles of roads, fences, landscapes remind me that, and us, that we must never forget. If we fail, then the girls' bravery will have been all for nothing. Now, I took Michelle there yesterday at Granny. And the lines of the two famine orphans now number in the thousands. Many are in the local area. I believe it's the strength of all the women before us, as I said, those who had no choice but to adapt and be resilient. They've made us and me the strong woman, my daughter Kelly, who we are today. Started for me with two 16-year-old girls who boarded ships to go across the seas. And I want to say thank you to all of you for allowing me to stand up here and talk your ears off. I'm going to hopefully leave you with That's the beautiful Nicola O'Hare and the words written by Brendan Graham. So an Irish girl and an Irish singer, songwriter who made that especially for the girls. So it's a beautiful piece, I think, if you haven't seen it.
How long did the journey take?
Up between 3 months and 4 months. Yeah.
Can you ask the question?
Okay,
You
yes.
might repeat them just so.
Yes, I will.
that
So
someone
could
can
I
comment
just
too.
have a mouthful? I just have a mouthful of tea. Oh, yes, I would. Thank you. I'm very happy to take questions. I will try my very best to answer them. And if I can't answer them, I'm happy to take them on notice and get back to you. And I hope I wasn't too long.
No,
Would there be any stops in the way then?
Look, yep, the gentleman has asked, would there be any stops? Possibly in Africa to take on extra food, water supplies, but then it was straight through to Australia. Yes.
Steve Hart.
Yes.
Am I right in saying his people came from Galway?
So Steve Hart's mother is Bridget Young. So that's the girl we were talking about. His father was Richard Hart, pickpocket out of Dublin.
And what do you think of Peter Carey's book?
What do I think of Peter Carey's book? Great question. Peter Carey's book is a work of fiction. It does a great disservice because it says true story, which he didn't want as the title because people see it as the true story. I am personally not a fan of Peter Carey's writing, so that was a block to it in the first place. People love it as a piece of writing, but it is fiction. So that's absolutely what it is. There is a lot of a lot of work in there that sends people down a very wrong path about not only the Kelly story, but around a lot of things that were happening in Ireland. That's what I think of his book. Is it on my bookcase?
Yeah,
Yes.
Last one. Did the Kellys, what was their association with Greta?
That's where they lived. So, how about, I'm happy to take, so the Kellys, so Ellen Quinn was Ned's mother. So Ellen Quinn's sister, Catherine Quinn, is my two-time great-grandmother as well. So I have that connection. So the Quinns came from Ballymena in County Antrim, and Ellen Quinn married John Red Kelly from Moyglass in Tipperary. He was sent out for stealing 2 pigs. He went to Van Diemen's Land. The Quinns were bounty migrants and had settled at a little place called Wallen, and that's where all of the girls married. Things were getting a little bit hot in Wallen. All of the boys were doing some wholesale and retail shifting of stock, and old man Quinn moved them all out from Greta. The girls stayed in Greta. James Quinn bought a 10,000-acre squatters run called Glenmore Station up the King Valley. And so the 2 Quinn girls had married the 2 Lloyd brothers by this stage, and so they were living at Greta. Ellen and John Kelly moved to Abnell after living at Beveridge. It was at Abnell that Red Kelly died of dropsy, and then Ellen moved all of her children and herself up to her sisters at Greta, and that's where she lived. At that time in the colony of Victoria and then the state of Victoria, women were not allowed to select land, but she was a widow, so she was able to select land. So she selected a small block of land not far. I haven't forgotten you, and I can see you, don't worry. That young man who's very insistent back there. So she selected a very, very unsuitable block of land not far from her sisters, just out of Greta. Yeah. I'm happy to answer any more questions.
Only Australia did not come to it. Was that everybody?
It was only Australia that these girls went to, Earl Grey. So that orphan girl scheme, we know that there were other schemes for female immigration. There was a shipload of girls that went from the Mount Bellew girls. They went to Western Australia. We know that ships went to Tasmania. We know that there was massive schemes where there were notice boards and notices plastered up all around Ireland, female immigration with, all these things promised that would be sent, and girls were promised employment and all these range of things. And so they went out to all states, but they did go out to other countries as well, female immigration. Absolutely, they did. Yeah, but not quite the same scheme.
You answered my question, but what refused is.
Yes, the fatal shore.
You spoke about the convict stain.
Yes.
And it seems from what you said that the convict stain it's
So-
gone with feeling consciousness, but when he was writing, it seems to be quite living.
Look, it absolutely was. For a long time, it was, you could not talk about having a convict in your family, and probably 2 generations ago, having a convict was just whitewashed, and people would whitewash that out. One of my Lloyd ancestors married a convict who was the first mailman from Melbourne to Sydney, and when her great-grandson was doing the research, his name was John Conway Burke, a convict from England. They had rewritten the history about how he had this wonderful background in England, but he actually wasn't. He was a convict, and so she had burnt all of his diaries. But to have a convict in your ancestry now is really to be royalty, and we've got royalty in our room because my friend Michelle is known as what is known as a first fleeter because her Irish convict ancestors came out on the first fleet in 1788. So the convict stain, for most people, is seen as it's just we have a greater understanding of knowing why they were sent, what the background was, what the context was, and we know that there were many reasons why people were sent out, but there were some serious criminals as well. You know, we know there were the cases of bread stealing, button stealing, butter, but we also know that people were sent out for very serious crimes like any other thing as well. So.
It's related to that, and then I was just looking very briefly now, when we go through quickly at some of the names of children.
Yes.
And their children coming after that again. You don't see the Moras or the Shawns. You know, I'm just wondering, did they just really try and sort of nearly forget about Ireland or not try and kind of carry on the...
No, I don't believe they did. They did forget about Ireland, but it was just a different. No, so it was, no, they didn't know. But we, all in our families, Sean, but there was Thomas's, John's, Margaret's, all spelt in those the correct ways. Marie's, Winifred's, Catherine's. So they were all named up. There's a few wild names in there. We've got no idea, like, where did that come from? It's like, where did Leo come from? You know, where did
Was there a Pope Leo?
probably? Yeah.
No, dates are, that's a late.
Yeah. So yes. So, you know, but they did, we've got, you know, for me, I've got a very good memory, but when some of my family say, which Tom was it? Which John was it? Which Jack, who are you talking about? But they were anglicised when in, and I think that was just as they arrived, and certainly the convict registers were anglicised there, very much so.
Is it very difficult to actually do that search? I mean, are the sources kind of easy enough to follow, or have you a lot of kind of digging around to do?
It depends. Some people you can trace quite easily, but when you start finding people with the same names, you have to apply the research principles really, really carefully. And as you know, verify once, verify twice, cross-reference. If it is a convict, most convicts have really good records. But you know, Michelle has great trouble finding some of hers. I am blessed, and it's a shackle at the same time, because I have such an infamous part of the family is that it's documented, but I can thank the Victorian government and the Victorian police for documenting my family and records so well and taking photos of a number of them. They had their photos, otherwise I don't have them. You know, I have their heights, I have their eye colour, you know, and we can go, oh, well, that's where those hazel eyes came from. You know, Dad's got hazel eyes, you know, and that's where the men have got, you know, we know that because we can see that in their prison records. So thank you to the Victorian government, thank you to the police very much for that.
Was there any record of the Irish language?
Look, we haven't seen any in our family. There's been a bit of a discussion around that, especially in the Ned Kelly story, because people want to keep having him speak in an Irish accent. Now, my father is 85, his cousin is 87. His cousins, who are Kelly descendants, are all around the same age, and none of them remember they all remember, I should say, Ned's youngest full sibling, Jim Kelly, who did not speak with an Irish accent, but certainly Irish words, Irish inflection. On my mum's side, who came from Clare, they came out as Irish railway gangers in 1885. They did not have any Irish. Pa was the first born in Australia, although his siblings were all born in Ireland. And my auntie Peg, I remember her really well. She was born here in Ireland, but she did not, if she spoke any Irish, she didn't have any, but certainly used a lot of words that people will say to me, what did you say and why do you say it like that? And we can trace it back. I said to someone the other day, my dad still says film, and you know, all of those we're going, we've just seen that film, and there's lots of words that the inflection is there. So, yeah. Yes.
I'm Thomas from my cousin, and thank you, Irene, and thank you for that wonderful talk.
My pleasure. As I said, I hope I can keep people interested in, because as my mum says, like the sound of my own voice.
I make a couple of observations. I'm not at the beginning of this story
Yeah.
myself. In 30 years, researching,
Yes,
reading.
you've got Trevor McLaughlin's book
I
there.
have all this,
Yeah.
and I've spoken to him
Yes.
on a few.
He opened up he broke it all
And
open.
that's what I was asking. Would you say a few words about Trevor?
Oh, Trevor, and if you talk to anybody who's done any research on these girls, it was Trevor who lifted the lid on Irish famine orphans, because we knew who the names of these girls were. We possibly, you know, people knew what the ships were, but what was the scheme and where did they come from, and putting it together. Trevor did the work. He did the eye bleeding, and where most of us are of a certain age where we've looked at microfiche, microfilm long before. I've had young reachers say to me, what's microfiche? And I go, oh, okay. You know, but he did the work, he went through all the registers, he transcribed them, he found what ship, where they came from, and he put it into 2 volumes, and he started to give lectures on where these girls came from and raise their profile. He did that work, and he's still doing that work with his online stuff. Yeah, he's the founding father of it. Yeah.
This just for people here that want to know more about it.
Yes.
This is the first one.
Yes.
It's not just an ordinary book.
No.
And it's.
Why don't you stand up and talk about it?
I notice up on your chart here.
Yes, that's from him. I've got it sourced.
It shows all the work
Yes.
in Ireland where they
Yes.
came from. But I'm a small time antiquarian book collector.
Oh, yes.
And this particular book that I have, the very first page on it is to my mum, love Trevor McLaughlin, the 24th of the 1st, 1992.
Yes.
I actually have acquired Trevor's book that Trevor sent to his mum after he.
Well, don't put it down. Don't you put that down. Michelle can see my eyes and my fingers starting to go like this.
And when I got it, I actually got some photographs and whatever.
Don't put it down.
And after his mother passed, this book made its way to a local bookseller. And he had no idea.
No, he would not have.
And I found out about it,
Yeah.
and I snapped it up very quickly.
I bet you did.
And I treasure it.
What other books have you got? Because I saw you come in. What other books have you got there?
Yeah, I have been linking with this whole team, and one of the little snippets of information which might add to your collection.
Absolutely.
Was how did the girls go from the various workhouses to the ship that took them to Australia? So I have done that tracing work. Starting off,
We'll be having a little conversation.
Starting off in
Yeah.
Ireland.
Yes.
If you take the girls in the workhouse in Knockray, they travelled by Ballincollig coach. Ballincollig had set up, you will have known. He set up Ireland's mass transport system,
Yes.
horse and carriage. from town and village.
Yes.
He took them to Ballinasloe. Ballinasloe was strategic because there was a canal after being built to the Shannon. And the Shannon, the canal system was a big part of how the girls were transported all to Dublin.
Fantastic.
So they went.
So that's why I needed to be here tonight, because that one thing.
The two canals, so the main Shannon.
Yep.
From all the way down to Limerick, that were connecting with that and transport.
So they didn't go road all the way, they went by,
But transport was by boat.
Yes.
Because this was before trains.
yeah,
You
yeah.
know, and then there's a number of ships and a smaller car that brought them to Plymouth.
Yes.
On the south coast of England, and that's where they all travelled to Australia.
We'll have a chat over a cup of tea and exchange some emails. What other books have you got there? I saw you come in with a, yes,
I have a few more.
yes,
Irish Famine in Colonial.
yes, yep. Richard Reid,
So,
do you have this one, which I would like to present to this one, which is Charles Strutt's book.
Thank you very much. And just on behalf of the Annaghdown Heritage Society, we would like to talk of appreciation.
Oh, thank
for
you.
yourself.
And I thought you might like this one as well, which just a little, which is written by a friend of mine, signed by him, signed by the editor who's now passed, and myself and both of Bridget's great grandchildren, but from different lines who helped with that. So
Fantastic. And I think we can probably kind of claim Ned Kelly a little bit.
absolutely you can.
I
Yeah,
think
you can.
we can.
Yeah.
For the purposes of the recording, I think we might call a halt to the talk at this stage.
Yeah.
But we will have tea and biscuits down in the kitchen for anyone who'd like to continue the conversation. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Sincere thanks to Noeleen for what was absolutely fascinating talk. SMS is up there as well. One from Marie to everyone. Great presentation, Noeleen.
Oh, thank you so much
for
to all of
sharing
them.
your very interesting family story. Yes, thanks very much, Noeleen, for a really fascinating presentation. And many thanks to all for facilitating the Zoom for those of us unable to attend in person. Much appreciated. And Marie, thank you to Annaghdown Heritage Society. Wonderful. So we'll say good night to online.
And thank you
And
all
thank
for
you
your
very much
patience
for your patience
big-
and for joining us.
Oh, thank you.